Hey everyone, and welcome to Quick Country Histories. Today, we're going to unpack the incredible, and let's be honest, often really turbulent story of Hong Kong.
So when you think of Hong Kong, this is probably what comes to mind, right? A dazzling, almost futuristic skyline. It's an absolute powerhouse of international trade and finance, and truly one of the most dynamic cities on Earth. But what if I told you that this whole global metropolis was built on what a British official once basically dismissed as a barren rock with nary a house upon it?
So, how in the world did that barren rock turn into the city we all recognize today? Well, that's exactly the question we're going to answer. We'll trace its journey through 5 key eras.
We'll kick things off way back in its ancient past, then jump into the British colonial era that really shaped it. After that, we'll see its amazing post-war rebirth, break down the historic 1997 handover to China, and finally, take a look at its complex and pretty tense present.
All right, let's get into it. For thousands and thousands of years, the land we now call Hong Kong was, well, it was a pretty distant and sparsely populated spot on the very edge of Imperial China.
You know, this timeline really puts things in perspective. I mean, we're talking about human activity from over 30,000 years ago. For centuries, it was this quiet but useful little outpost, known for salt and pearls. It even had a moment in the spotlight as a refuge for a fleeing emperor. But the real takeaway here, the thing to remember, is that even as late as 1841, the population was tiny, just over 7,000 people, mostly fishermen and charcoal burners.
Okay, now we're going to jump forward to the 19th century. This is where things get dramatic. A collision of global trade and conflict is about to change Hong Kong's destiny forever.
So, the story really kicks off with a massive trade problem. Britain was obsessed with Chinese tea and silk, but China just wasn't buying British stuff. To balance the books, Britain started smuggling massive amounts of opium from India into China. When the Chinese emperor tried to shut down this drug trade, well, that's what sparked the First Opium War.
And this is where it gets really fascinating. This table basically shows you how modern Hong Kong was built, piece by piece. After a couple of wars, Britain gets Hong Kong Island and the Kowloon Peninsula forever. But then, and this is the crucial part, in 1898 they lease a much bigger area, the New Territories, for 99 years. And that lease, ending in 1997, became this giant ticking clock that defined everything that happened for the next century.
So, under British rule, Hong Kong completely transformed. It became this bustling crown colony. It had this amazing deep-water harbor, which was perfect for trade, and the British brought in their own systems of law, education, and government. It basically created this unique, powerful gateway between China and the rest of the world.
But Hong Kong's rise wasn't a straight line up. Not at all. The 20th century brought its absolute darkest hour during World War II. But what came after was one of the most incredible economic comebacks you've ever seen. So by 1941, right before the Pacific War really kicked off, Hong Kong was a thriving, crowded place. We're talking 1.6 million people.
But then, after a brutal 3.5-year occupation by Imperial Japan, that number crashed to just 600,000. It was a horrifying time. Starvation, violence. The colony was just left in ruins.
So how on earth did Hong Kong bounce back from that? It's an amazing story. Really. This post-war rebirth was fueled by what you could call a perfect storm. First, when the communists took over mainland China, a wave of refugees poured into Hong Kong. And these weren't just anybody. They were skilled industrialists and a massive workforce. That influx of talent and labor turned the city into a manufacturing powerhouse. Then, as China started opening up its economy, Hong Kong pivoted again, brilliantly, becoming the key financial hub to manage all that crazy growth. And all that brings us right up to the moment when that 99-year clock from 1898 finally hit zero. Let's talk about the historic handover of 1997. As 1997 got closer, Britain and China had to figure out a deal for the city's future. And what they came up with was this bold, unprecedented political experiment. It's called One Country, Two Systems. The idea was pretty revolutionary. Hong Kong would become part of China, that's the one country part, but would get to keep its own capitalist economy, its legal system, its own money, and all its personal freedoms for 50 years. That's the two systems part.
And this slide gives you a great snapshot of what that actually looked like on the ground. On July 1st, 1997, the big symbols of power changed overnight. The British flag came down, the governor was out, a chief executive was in, and God Save the Queen was gone. But for the average person, daily life felt, well, pretty much the same. You were still driving on the left, you were still using the Hong Kong dollar, and you still had to go through a border to get to the mainland.
But the handover was not the end of the story. Not even close. The 21st century has brought more economic success for sure, but also some really deep political challenges and a whole lot of tension.
Yeah, since the handover, a central theme has really been this constant push and pull between the city's promised autonomy and the central government's authority. This timeline just hits some of the key moments, from the massive protests back in 2003 to the Occupy movement in 2014 demanding more democracy, and of course the huge protests of 2019. Each of these events really forced the question about the future of the one country, two systems model, and it all led to a new national security law being passed in 2020.
And that brings us right up to today. You know, Hong Kong's story is one of constant radical change. From a quiet fishing village to an imperial port, from a factory floor to a global financial center. And now, past the halfway mark of this unique 50-year arrangement, the question of what's next for Hong Kong, well, it's one of the most closely watched stories on the entire planet.
Hey, thanks so much for joining us for this one. If you found it interesting, we've got a whole playlist of these quick country histories that you should definitely check out.